You know, there are so many great, you go to Mises.org over the years, there's just, you know, name after name after name of great economists. And when we think of the Mises Institute, we think of, you know, Joe Salerno and a lot of guys like that who have been around for a while, but there are a lot of up and coming people associated with the Mises Institute. And our guest right now is one of those. He's a Mises U alumni, and he's a PhD student right now at Middle Tennessee State University, which is right down the road. And he is an intern and a writer at the Mises Institute right now. Anton Chamberlin.
Hey y'all, I'm Anton Chamberlin, as was just said. I'm currently an economics PhD student at Middle Tennessee State University, which is about, I don't know, down the road, down I-24. Though I imagine for this audience, being a member of academia isn't the best credential that I could put forth to give some credibility to myself. So I'd like to add that I'm also a product of the Ron Paul Revolution. The 2012 campaign, to be more specific. So I've been a libertarian for over 11 years at this point. And my intellectual heart resides in Auburn, Alabama with the Mises Institute. I've been involved with them for going on a decade. So I attended Mises University first as a high school student. I spent the summer there as a research fellow multiple times, and I presented at various Mises Institute conferences. I think my last credential I'll give is I had the pleasure of spending my undergrad studying under the great Walter Block at Loyola University, New Orleans. That honor has allowed me to call Dr. Block both a mentor and a friend. But enough about me. I was asked to speak about Austrian economics. But before we do that, I thought it might be fun to see where bad economics leads us. So I decided to pull from the main source of intellectual scholarship today, Twitter. So let's dunk on the likes of Robert Reich and Nina Turner for a moment, shall we? But we're not going to start with them. We're going to start with a wonderful congresswoman from, I believe, Brooklyn. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez announced on Thursday that she reintroduced the Green New Deal in the House of Representatives. According to her Twitter link, quote, "The Green New Deal proposes to tackle the climate crisis with a 10-year mobilization that puts millions of Americans to work in good-paying union jobs. Similar to FDR's New Deal, these jobs would be focused on strengthening the nation's public infrastructure, as well as tackling pollution and climate damage." For those of you who need a refresher, I know I needed one, here are the stated goals of the Green New Deal from the bill. Goal number 1, to achieve the greenhouse gas and toxic emissions reductions needed to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers. Goal number 2, to create millions of good, high-wage union jobs and encourage collective bargaining agreements to ensure prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States. Goal number 3, to invest in the infrastructure and industry of the United States to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century. I love how wonderfully vague that one is. Goal number 4, this one's a doozy, to secure for all people of the United States for generations to come clean air and water, climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. Finally, goal number 5, to promote justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression for indigenous peoples, communities of color, migrant communities, deindustrialized communities, depopulated rural communities, the poor, low-income workers, women, the elderly, the unhoused, people with disabilities, and youth, referred to in this resolution as frontline and vulnerable communities. That was 12 listed communities in that bill, and just goal number 5. So I'll spare you the rest of the bill. Those are the stated goals for the Green New Deal. But I wanted to note the hubris needed to put that forward. The idea that the government could do any of those things, as we'll see later, is absurd, but that is where current political discourse is. AOC isn't alone. President Biden's nurse has been very active on his Twitter account this week. So we see similar sentiments out of her / our supposed president. 1, when the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations pay their fair share, we can invest in America. And by investing in America, We can lower costs for families and create good-paying jobs. That way, everyone has a fair shot. Another tweet. Federal investment attracts private investment. It creates jobs and industries, and it demonstrates we're all in this together. Since I took office, we've attracted commitments from more than $435 billion in private investment in American manufacturing and American energy. What do these statements assume? That the government is even capable of investing. We'll see later that it's not. But let's turn away from politicians and get to some of the promised targets. Nina Turner said this week, capitalism rewards capital, not labor. It's right in the name. How did I not know until I was 26 about this get-rich-quick scheme? Step number 1, build a factory. Step number 2. Step number 3, be filthy rich. Are you sure, Nina, that capital qua capital gets rewarded, or only when capital is used for value creation? And maybe that's true for labor too. You think people have to create things that people want to get rewarded? Yeah, that sounds so evil to me. She also recently applauded a proposal to raise the minimum wage for tourism workers in Los Angeles to a grand old $25 an hour. Finally, from her, there was a video posted of men working on skyscrapers and around, it looks like, my guess is like the 1930s or so. Someone captioned it with, "Dear men, what's stopping you from doing this?" And Nina Turner responded, "Pretty sure it's OSHA and trade unions preventing workers from working conditions like this." So apparently, without the government, we'd all risk death every day we went to work. Lastly, 2 tweets from Robert Reich. Just another reminder that trickle-down economics was invented by conservatives in the 1980s to justify massive tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. It's been nothing short of a disaster. Just a reminder, Dr. Reich, trickle-down economics isn't real and was invented by the left to distort conservative economic policy. And then this last one, it's a classic from Reich. But how can we afford paid leave? But how can we afford free childcare? But how can we afford student loan forgiveness? How can we afford universal health care? How? We make the super rich pay their fair share. Okay, yeah, that'll totally cover all of it. And the government can totally provide all of that too, in both sufficient and acceptable quantities. So then how can we avoid looking like these fools? Well, here enters Mises and Rothbard. Austrian economics gives us a clear and proper way to look at the world, not only with respect to voluntary exchange, but also with respect to the actions of the state. State actors are humans, after all. Well, most of them, at least. The jury's still out on Hillary Clinton. But that means that their actions fall under the praxeological umbrella. Now, do not misunderstand me. The mainstream neoclassical economic program also deals with the state, just not in a clear and proper way. Economic theory has always stressed the mutual benefits of voluntary exchange. Namely, through specialization and division of labor, society can be made better off. Wealth is not something discovered in the rocks, but generated by human action. So far, the Austrians and the neoclassicals are in agreement. Keynes might even agree so far, though he'll drop from our ranks once pedophilia enters the conversation. At any rate, here a divergence begins, one that libertarians would appreciate. For many economists of old, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, voluntary interactions had to be suspended in order to create the framework for which markets can function. For many economists, the state is necessary for markets to exist at all. What reasons do they give? There are a couple classic so-called market failures: public goods, monopoly, and negative externalities top the list. They'll say things like, the market won't produce enough of what we deem it ought to, or the market will always move towards aggregation, eventually resulting in the villain from WALL-E, by and large. Or better yet, the market is producing too much of something, and it's making some nosy liberals mad. These are some of the common reasons why certain goods must be provided by the state. But what if so-called public goods can actually be provided privately? What if monopolies don't emerge naturally on the market, but only out of government intervention? What if market failures in general are actually the result of legal failure, not unfettered exchange? Here I would like to now bring up one of the key lessons of Austrian economics, the importance of economic calculation. This idea is often taught in the context of socialism, but it applies more broadly, as we'll see too. But first, what is economic calculation, and how does it relate to socialism? To put it most succinctly, I will borrow from a famous tweet by Dr. Jonathan Newman. Mises destroyed socialism in this way. Without ownership, there's no exchange. Without exchange, there are no prices. Without prices, there is no economic calculation. Without economic calculation, production decisions are made in the dark. When that happens, basic needs go unmet. Put another way, Mises' impossibility thesis goes as follows. 1. Socialism abolishes private property in capital goods and natural resources. 2. Since the socialist state is sole owner of the material factors of production, they can no longer be exchanged. 3. Without exchange, there can be no market prices. 4. Under socialism, therefore, the state cannot calculate the cost of production for the goods it produces. And 5, finally, without calculation of profit and loss, socialist planners cannot know the most valuable uses of scarce resources, and therefore a socialist economy is impossible. Now, I'm sure most of you followed that, but some of you may be a little confused because of your definition of socialism, so here I would like to go off on a slight tangent. Many on the left are very quick to call anything they don't like fascism. That's obvious nonsense. But many on the right and many libertarians are quick also to label anything they don't like socialism and communism. This misunderstanding of socialism and communism leads some to make ridiculous claims like the family is communist. That sentence is absurd, but so is saying something like the US Postal Service is socialism. No. Socialism doesn't mean the government doing something. We must keep our terms clear. So what is capitalism? What is socialism? What is communism? There's much debate over whether communism and socialism are the same thing or not. The words seem to be at least colloquial synonyms, and their objectives at many times seem to be the same, but at least to Marx, communism was the anarchic final stage that followed after a period of socialism. So in order to keep these terms separate, we will use the following definitions, which these are the economic definitions of these terms. Capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. Socialism is state ownership of the means of production. Communism is communal ownership of the means of production. As you can see here, the distinguishing characteristic is how the means of production are handled in a given society, not whether the government provides certain goods or services, nor the level of sharing going on with respect to consumer goods. The economic debate is how to use our scarce resources to satisfy our ends. This is a question of efficient utilization of producer goods. So to return to the family claim, it should be clear why it's silly. It confuses the managerial question with the production question. The family contends with the following. Given how many pieces of corn are in the fridge, how shall I distribute them amongst my family? This is not the same question as, should any resources, and if so, which resources, should be directed towards the production of corn? Communal allocation post-production is not communism. Collectively determining what will be produced and how, removed from any market prices for consumer and producer goods, that is communism. So as long as the inputs that filled your fridge were privately owned, we're still talking about capitalism. If the government had to purchase resources on the market in order to operate the postal service, we're not talking about socialism. To return to the family once more, it is no less capitalistic nor libertarian that the family shares resources. Now, there's certainly a level of intervention that can be layered on top of capitalism, and how much intervention there is can get to the point where we're, in effect, living under de facto socialism, but I don't think that's the case in which we are right now, and I think there are very few instances where that becomes the case. So the mere presence of the Postal Service is not enough to say that we live in socialism, or even that that is socialism. So again, socialism is state ownership of the means of production. Given that the means of production are owned by the state, not private individuals, there are no markets and thus no prices for them. This ultimately means all economic decisions are made blindly. This is because economic calculation requires three things. 1, private property in all stages of goods, including capital goods of every kind. 2, freedom to exchange all kinds of goods and services. And 3, sound money, meaning a money whose value is independent of political influence, such as gold. All of these are abolished under the socialist program. The state is basically in a scenario where it cannot calculate profit and loss because it has no way of determining an economically meaningful number for its costs to subtract from its revenue. But I said this could be applied more broadly. For socialism, it cannot calculate because it has no cost figure. But what if an institution could not determine its revenue figure? Here we see how this argument applies to the state generally. Again, we just saw how without calculation, you cannot rationally and efficiently allocate resources towards various lines of production. You are necessarily guessing and wasting resources. The same applies for anything the state tries to do. Why? Because its revenue figure is fake. What is the state's revenue? The amount it brings in taxes. But this number is arbitrary and economically speaking meaningless. It also could be argued that the state has a way of manipulating how much it pays for inputs, so its cost figure is at the very least distorted. But even if we assume that's not the case, its revenue number is at the very least meaningless. Since you need both numbers to engage in economic calculation, this means the state cannot produce any good or service rationally or efficiently. So then what do we make of things like so-called government investment or claims of the government producing things? Well, these claims are obviously nonsense. Let's take production and parse out its economic definition. Let's assume that following a nice rain, you decide to make a literal mud pie. Very tasty. You produced something, you've made the mud pie. Have you engaged in production, though, in the economic sense? This question becomes, did you produce something of value? Assuming no one is willing to buy this mud pie from you, which I know is a stretch of an assumption, then you did not engage in production. You engaged in consumption for the love of the game, so to speak. The value creation came from you enjoying the process of colloquial production, but you did not engage in economic production. So what of governments producing roads, the postal service, etc.? Well, economic production requires market forces to determine whether an action is truly production or just consumption. All government provision of goods and services rests on involuntary exchanges, taxation. Without a valid source of revenue and costs, the state is incapable of engaging in profit and loss accounting. The revenue figure, being just the sum of taxes, was determined by the state itself, not voluntary market interactions reflecting consumer preferences. Thus, since a profit and loss calculation cannot take place, it cannot be determined whether the project was a good use of resources or not. Given the coercive nature of taxation, all government action cannot be classified as production then. Only consumption by state agents. Do governments engage in colloquial production? Sure. I-24 exists. But they did not engage in economic production, which is what really matters. Murray Rothbard put it this way in Man, Economy, and State. Resource-using expenditures by government are often considered investment, and this classification forms an essential part of Keynesian doctrine. But on the contrary, all of this expenditure must be considered consumption. Investment occurs when producers' goods are bought by entrepreneurs, not at all for their own use or satisfaction, but merely to reshape and sell them to others, ultimately the consumers. But government redirects the resources of society to its ends, chosen by it and backed by the use of force. Hence, these purchases must be considered consumption expenditures, whatever their intention or physical result. They are a particularly wasteful form of consumption, however, since they are generally not regarded as consumption expenditures by government officials. An Austrian framework also gives us the tools to deconstruct mainstream economic theories. For this, I would like to return to one of those supposed justifications for government. Traditional public goods theory often runs as follows. Some goods are special and suffer from non-rivalrousness and non-excludability, which means they will not be adequately provided for on the market, if at all. Thus, the state must provide them. And to clarify, non-rivalrousness means many people can enjoy the same thing without detracting from the experience of others, like watching a movie. You know, you're sitting in a movie theater. If it's just you in the movie theater and someone else walks in and sits on the other side, like it doesn't matter. Non-excludability means you can't exclude non-payers, like with a fireworks show. If a city decides to shoot out fireworks and you live a couple miles away, you're not sitting there, you didn't pay, but you can still see them from your porch maybe, and so they can't exclude you. This theory is a favorite among those that favor governments. In order to deconstruct it, I would like to rely on chapter 10 of A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hermann Hoppe. First, is there actually a clear distinction between public goods and private goods. Many seemingly public goods are provided privately, and vice versa. All of the alleged public goods have been provided historically in the past, including the postal service, streets, and even lighthouses. Lighthouses are almost always the standard first example of public goods presented, but they were provided for privately in the past. So do public goods exist then? We can answer this question by discussing what is an economic good. Economic theory tells us what an economic good is, so then what are we talking about here? So as Hoppe wrote, for something to be a good, it must be realized and treated as scarce by someone. Something is not a good as such, but goods are goods only in the eye of the beholder. Nothing is a good without at least one person subjectively evaluating it as such. But then, since no physicochemical analysis can identify something as an economic good, there is clearly no fixed objective criterion for classifying goods as either private or public. They can never be private or public goods as such. There's nothing inherent in a good that tells you whether it's a public good or a private good. Since it's entirely subjective, it is only the economic agent in question that determines whether something is an economic good or an economic bad, for that matter. Given this subjectivity, then, economic good status is entirely flexible and changeable. To return to Hoppe, a good's private or public character depends on how few or how many people consider them to be goods, with the degree to which they are public or private changing as these evaluations change, running from 1 to infinity. Even seemingly completely private things, like the interior of my apartment or the color of my underwear, thus can become public goods as soon as somebody else starts caring about them. And seemingly public goods, like the exterior of my house or the color of my overalls, can become extremely private goods as soon as other people stop caring about them. What are we left with then? We are left with subjective economic goods with varying levels of excludability and rivalrousness. So regardless of these characteristics, goods valued by society have to be produced on the market, even the more traditional, quote, public goods. So we have no distinction, either in economic theory or in historical production. But we're not done yet. Yes, private actors have produced roads and provided the mail in the past, but what if they did so at an inadequate level? What if there were too few roads before the government got in the road business? The error here is this. To make this claim, you must smuggle in an ethical norm into your line of reasoning. And economics is supposed to be a positive science. Without doing this, you can never reach the fact that a good ought to be produced simply from the fact that it would not be produced. To speak of insufficient production is a normative claim, which requires defense, yet the literature is sparse with its ethical justifications of this. Hoppe attempts to save them by giving them a rationale, though it only saves them in that it gives them an ethical norm, not a particularly good one. So Hoppe says, whenever it can somehow be proven that the production of a particular good or service has a positive effect on someone, but would not be produced at all, or would not be produced in a definite quantity or quality unless others participated in its financing, then the use of aggressive violence against these people is allowed, either directly or indirectly, with the help of the state, and these persons may be forced to share in the necessary financial burden. In order to justify public good provisions, you must argue that basically it's acceptable for anyone to aggress upon anyone if he feels like it. This is hardly a fair or acceptable proposition. Even if we postulate that positive economic analysis grants the existence of a lack of or a lower production of a certain good, it does not follow that it must be produced by the state to a sufficient level. Because even then, on what grounds do you make the claim? How exactly do you determine the sufficient or adequate level of production? We now see two strikes against public goods theory brought to us by Austrian economics. One, I lost my place. One, the distinction between public and private goods is fake. And two, to argue that such goods ought to be produced when they are not is an unjustifiable ethical claim. The final counter-argument is as follows. So first, we will begin with conceding the 2 points we just proven are wrong. We will concede, one, for the sake of argument, that public goods exist, and two, that they are desirable. Even still, public goods theory requires one more important leap of logic. The final leap is this. Since public goods are desirable, they must be provided by the state. But economic policy ought not be determined merely by what is desirable. Plenty of fanciful ideas are desirable in theory, removed from other considerations, yet economically undesirable. This is because the question is not simply whether the public good in question is desirable. Our economic decision is not whether to produce something desirable or not. Scarcity means that every act of production has an opportunity cost. Every dollar spent, every resource used to create the public good must come from somewhere else in the economy. Resources must be siphoned off from private goods production in order to produce the supposedly desirable public good. The economic question is this: which is more valuable, which is more urgent, the public good or the private good that would have been produced in its place? Has this question been answered? Yes, and that is precisely the perceived problem. This entire discussion exists only because consumers have answered this question, and they have answered this question resoundingly, and their answer has been deemed unsatisfactory by wannabe central planners. To return to Hoppe, in terms of consumer evaluations, however high its absolute level might be, the value of the public goods is relatively lower than that of competing private goods, because if one had left the choice to the consumers, they evidently would have preferred spending their money differently. Otherwise, no force would have been necessary. This proves beyond any doubt that the resources used for the provision of public goods are wasted, as they provide consumers with goods or services which are at best only of secondary importance. What then is our final argument? Hoppe summarizes it this way: even if one assumed that public goods, which can be distinguished clearly from private goods, existed, and even if we granted that a given public good might be useful, public goods would still compete with private goods. And there is only one method of finding out whether or not they are more urgently desired and to what extent: by having everything provided by freely competing private enterprise. Hence, contrary to the conclusion arrived at by public goods theorists, logic forces one to accept the result that only a pure market system can safeguard the rationality, from the point of view of the consumers, of a decision to produce a public good. So, 1. Public goods do not exist separately from private goods. 2. Even if they did, to argue that they are desirable requires sneaking in an ethical norm, one that's seldom defended. And this norm is hardly justifiable. And 3, even if we assume that public goods exist and that they are desirable, any attempt by the state to produce them must necessarily be a waste of resources, a diversion of our resources away from our most pressing wants and desires in the direction of, at best, secondary wants and desires. Public goods do not exist, and even if they did, it would not be desirable nor ethical for the state to produce them. Before concluding, I feel compelled to make one more slightly tangential point. Dave Smith readily, and I believe correctly, comments that libertarians need to learn their cultural lesson. Culture matters, and a culture needs to be more than just the non-aggression principle. Now, do not misunderstand me. I am not saying the state should exist or impose any type of social norms. But we kid ourselves if we truly believe that a society that only strictly adheres to the NAP will be a good and prosperous society. I am not proposing any violations of the NAP, but there are non-NAP violations that are not conducive to a flourishing society. As Dr. Block points out, blackmail is not strictly speaking an NAP violation. Neither is lying, assuming it's not fraud. But a society where these non-NAP violations are common or even encouraged will not promote trust. And without trust, markets find it very hard to function. A purely voluntary society would more than likely produce rules that extend beyond the NAP, and for good reason. It's worth considering then which types of social norms are better and worse, both for people and by extension the economy. A society rife with high time preference and hedonism could be a perfectly libertarian society, and it would destroy souls and eventually itself. Austrian economics teaches us that low time preference is a virtue for economic progress and human flourishing. Prudence tells us we should value that and shape culture accordingly. Economics exists on its own as a positive science. Austrian economics, qua Austrian economics, tells nothing about which social orders are preferable. But economics is a tool that we can use to better understand our world, so we ought to use this understanding to make the world a better place. So how can we do that? Well, Austrian economics allows us to analyze the economic actions of everyone, including the state. From an understanding of the process and importance of economic calculation, we can see that the state is inherently wasteful and inefficient, regardless of what it is trying to do. This makes any talk of government investment or production nonsensical. The Austrian tradition also gives us a different and better understanding of the world than the mainstream economic tradition. This allows us to refute common arguments for the state, like public goods theory. Finally, we must also resolve to use this understanding for the betterment of humanity, which means learning our cultural lesson. If we truly value human flourishing, we must consider which social norms best promote a good society and best foster economic progress. With Mises and Rothbard in our quiver, I'm fully confident we can do that. Thank you.